London, 1843. The city slept under scandal. In the grand ballroom of Ravenshoe House, the air still shimmered with candle smoke and whispers, remnants of an evening that had rewritten two destinies. The orchestra's final notes had long since died, yet the gossip had not. Somewhere between waltz and ruin, Lady Clara Whitmore had been discovered, in the Duke's arms, in the wrong room, at the wrong hour. The truth had been innocent enough, a fainting spell, a misplaced concern, a door that had betrayed them both. But innocence was fragile in a city that feasted on implication. By dawn the papers had already written their marriage in ink. Now, beneath the sombre arches of a private chapel, the deed was being made official. No guests, no joy, only the rustle of the priest's robes and the unrelenting sound of the rain against stained glass. Clara stood before Alexander, Duke of Ravenshoe, in a gown borrowed from necessity, her hands trembling around the single bouquet she'd been told to carry. The petals had begun to wilt, as if they too understood the futility of beauty here. He was immaculate as ever, tall, restrained, every inch the English peer. But there was something new in his posture, a stiffness born not of pride but punishment. He would not look at her, not once. "Do you, Alexander, take this woman?" His reply was a quiet, unhesitating, "I do." "Do you, Clara Whitmore?" Her voice faltered. For a moment she thought she might say no, let ruin come, let London devour her. But her father's debts, her mother's tears, her family's reputation, all the invisible hands that had pressed her into this moment, left her no mercy. "I do." When the priest declared them husband and wife, no one smiled. Not even heaven. The rain grew louder, drowning what little dignity the vows might have held. The Duke turned to her at last, not in affection, but acknowledgement, and offered his arm. His touch was cold through the fabric. They left the chapel in silence, stepping into a carriage bound not for celebration, but confinement. Ravenshoe Hall awaited, vast and grey, its corridors echoing the kind of loneliness money could not soften. The housekeeper greeted them with the precision of habit. Servants bowed as though attending a funeral. Their eyes followed Clara with quiet curiosity. The new Duchess no one had expected, the scandal no one dared to name. Dinner was served and barely touched. He spoke little, and when he did, it was with the civility one offers a stranger, one must protect. She thanked him for the arrangement that saved her family, for the house and dowry he had provided. He inclined his head and replied only, "It is what must be done." That night, Clara lay in the bridal chamber that had not been prepared for love. White roses arranged by custom, a fire that burned more for propriety than warmth. She removed her veil and looked into the mirror. The face that stared back was pale, composed, unrecognizable. In the corridor beyond, she heard his footsteps, steady, pacing, restless. He passed her door twice before finally stopping. The silence between them stretched, fragile and unbearable. Then came a soft knock. "Come in," she whispered. The door opened slowly, the candlelight catching on the wet edges of his hair, the fine cut of his jaw, the exhaustion etched beneath restraint. "I wished to see that you were settled," he said. "I am," she lied. He hesitated. There was something almost human in his hesitation, as though the Duke and the man inside him were still deciding who would speak next. "You should know," he said. "This marriage is for your protection, for appearances. You owe me nothing, and I shall expect nothing." Her heart faltered, then steadied. "Nothing?" He looked away. Affection cannot be conjured where duty begins. And yet, in that moment, it existed, unspoken, uninvited, alive. The candle flickered between them like a witness reluctant to intervene. She could smell the rain on his coat, the faint trace of tobacco and storm. For the first time since the ceremony, she saw not a duke, but a man, one burdened by honor, guilt, and a loneliness that mirrored her own. "Good night, Your Grace," she said softly. He turned to go, but before the door closed, lightning flared, sudden, violent, illuminating the doubt on his face. Their eyes met. Neither moved. And in that charged silence, duty faltered. He crossed the threshold again, slowly, as if walking toward a sentence already written. No words, only the sound of the storm and the fragile surrender of two people who had been taught all their lives to feel nothing, and failed gloriously for one night. Dawn arrived without ceremony. A thin grey wash poured over London, as if the city, too, wished to be excused from remembering. Ravenshaw Hall exhaled the smoke of a sleepless night. In the bridal chamber, the roses had turned their faces toward the window, as though light might excuse them from their duty to be beautiful in a room that had not asked for beauty. Clara lay awake and motionless, the sheet drawn to her collarbones like a vow she did not sign. Beside the mirror, the veil waited for instruction and received none. The knock she expected did not come. The housekeeper's footfall hesitated outside, then passed on. Trays were arranged elsewhere, voices kept to corridors, the entire staff performing the art of not existing. When Clara rose, it was with the softness of someone who knows how to leave a room so completely that the air forgets her shape. She dressed in travelling grey, no lace, no ornaments, and pinned her hair with the precision of women who intend to survive mornings. In the library, a single lamp still burned. The Duke had left it. His coat from the night before hung over the back of a chair, rain dark at the shoulders, waiting like a sentence that had not been read aloud. She stood a moment and touched the fabric only with her eyes. Then she found paper and wrote a note that was not a letter, signed a name that was not yet hers to sign, and folded silence into thirds. By the time the house woke, Clara Whitmore had vanished. No carriage was heard departing, no maid saw a cloak. Only the side gate noticed it had been gently shut. London swallowed her between two breaths and carried on with its commerce of appearances. He found the lamp first, then the empty chair, then the small square of paper on which she had written 4 sentences and a future. "Forgive me, protect yourself, do not look for what cannot endure the looking, be kind to the memory of last night." He read them once as a duke, measuring consequence in, then again as a man measuring absence. The second reading cost more. The household offered what households offer: tea, the suggestion of breakfast, the balm of routine. He refused the first, ignored the second, and walked the third, until the carpets remembered how many steps a human being can take without arriving anywhere. At noon he received his secretary. At 1, he signed 3 documents and could not bring his hand to form a 4th. At 2, he stood in the chapel where rain had been their witness and found it suddenly intolerable that water has no sense of privacy. Society accepted its version of the story with appetite. A midnight bride and a morning disappearance. The city did not even require motive, it required only rhythm. Some said she had been paid, others said she had refused to be a stipend when love had been a syllable the groom would not pronounce. A few, cruel in the manner of the comfortably married, suggested that the Duke had invented a wife for a night, if only to exhaust the columnists and turn their pens elsewhere. He did nothing to correct them. Truth, when exposed to London air, becomes an infection. In the weeks that followed, he perfected a new etiquette, speaking only when necessary, attending only those obligations that protected property from gossip and gossip from property. He hunted less, He read more. He learned how to sleep in 2-hour treaties. The butler, who had survived 3 administrations and more tragedies than a choir could sing, discovered that there are silences a tray cannot mend, and responded with the only cure he knew: service made sacred by accuracy. If the Duke noticed the jasmine appearing in a certain room once a week, he did not say so. If he opened the window an inch farther on the days the rain rehearsed memory, no one mentioned it. Clara travelled south until the snow conceded defeat, and fields remembered how to be green. In a market town no one in London could pronounce, she became a person who could: Mrs. Hale, the polite widow who taught letters to village girls and paid her rent on time. She did not tremble when strangers knocked. She kept a teacup in a cupboard no one else opened. She learned the names of hedgerow birds because knowledge is a way of owning hours that would otherwise own you. When she fainted once in the lane and woke in the apothecary's back room, she realized that the future had already begun writing its first paragraph. Spring found her with a secret that did not ask permission to grow. She walked early before the town could perform its curiosity, and counted her steps the way a soldier counts supplies. The midwife, practical and unafraid, said nothing unnecessary and everything true. In the chapel of a different parish, candlelight offered her a mercy the London priest had not: silence without judgment. She carried her condition as women have always carried the weather, bravely, privately, with the knowledge that storms do not check guest lists. When the child came, on a night so gentle the moon forgot to rise, he opened his eyes with the calm astonishment of someone who has arrived on time. They were grey, like the river when it thinks about rain. Clara, who had planned to be stronger than tears, failed the plan and forgave herself at once. She named him Julian, because some names make promises to the future without insolence. The midwife wrote Father Unknown in a ledger that already knew too much about the world, and closed it as carefully as if it were a wound. Years resumed their work. He grew first into his mother's arms, then into boots that disobeyed puddles. He learned to read too early because books were the only men allowed unlimited access to the house. He asked for stories about ships and maps and gardens. When he asked about dukes, Clara taught him geography instead. On Julian's 3rd birthday, he brought her a handful of wildflowers so untheatrical that they broke her heart with relief. She kissed his hair and told herself that some bargains with the past must be paid in lilies and silence. Back in London, Parliament invented new reasons to need the Duke's voice. He supplied it, and people mistook the precision for peace. At night he discovered how many glasses a man can pour without drinking any of them. On mornings when fog sat low on the river, he walked along it as if understanding its reluctance to rise. Invitations came and were stacked. Ladies tried the art of conversation and found him courteous and unrestorable. If any woman resembled Clara from a certain angle, he looked away and did not forgive the angle. Once, returning late from a vote whose result would employ 100 men to make the rich feel righteous, he stopped before the private chapel and entered. No rain this time, only dust that had renamed itself devotion. He stood at the place where vows are spoken and counted backward. One night, he told the empty air. I had a life for one night. The air, being English, did not make a scene. 7 years made their small amendments. The house learned how not to expect laughter and suffered less for the adjustment. The staff discovered that kindness could be practiced without witnesses and practiced it anyway. The Duke's hair kept its stubborn darkness except at the temples, where truth keeps its trophies. He did not speak her name, but he financed 3 village schools whose ledgers never appeared in the papers. Charity, when it is apology, prefers aliases. news of a charity fete reached the countryside one autumn with the authority of a season. Ravenshire would open its gardens to dignitaries and donors. The city would bring its manners to the lawn and pretend it had invented benevolence. The neighbouring household where Mrs. Hale taught would attend, children in best coats, a governess who preferred the edges of crowds, a boy who asked intelligent questions about everything that grows. Clara read the notice and laid it aside with hands that did not shake. Then she picked it up again, not for the words, but for the date. Fate does not always send thunder. Sometimes it reserves a Saturday. She told herself she would not go. Then she counted her reasons and found they were 4 short of sufficient. On the morning of the fete, she dressed in the unremarkable blue of women who do not intend to be recognized and braided her hair with the competence of survival. Julian, who had inherited curiosity from both parents, fastened his collar and asked whether dukes were taller than ordinary men or merely less inclined to bend. She kissed his forehead and answered, "Both." In London, the Duke instructed the gardeners to be kind to roses that did not owe the season their blossoms. He wore his public face and felt it settle like armour that has learned its weight. When he stepped onto the terrace and saw the first carriages thread the drive, he did not think of last nights or vanished mornings. He thought only of the dignity required to greet the world without breaking it. And then a governess in blue stepped onto his lawn, and the world remembered how to be loud without making a sound. The gardens of Ravenshire had never been so alive, and yet for him life had never felt so still. 7 years had turned the Duke into a portrait, admired from afar, untouchable up close. His hair was darker now, his expression more precise, his smiles, when they appeared, merely professional gestures borrowed for diplomacy. Only the grey at his temples betrayed that he had been fighting something other than time. The annual charity fete had been his secretary's idea, not his own. London adored benevolence when served with champagne and rose arches. So on a Saturday, stitched together by sunlight and pretence, the Duke opened his gates to the world he had long stopped believing in. Children chased ribbons across the lawns, dowagers whispered about reform, the orchestra performed politeness in waltz form. He stood by the marble fountain, greeting guests with mechanical courtesy, every word as rehearsed as a prayer, no longer felt. And then, between the shimmer of parasols and chatter, something in the crowd shifted. A blue gown, plain, elegant, deliberate, moved across the garden path. Its wearer carried herself with that quiet authority that comes only from hardship endured and grace unadvertised. He turned, and the world, for one blinding instant, ceased its ceremony. Clara. She was older, of course, though the word older seemed profane when faced with the soft precision of her calm. Her face had gentled, her posture remained noble, and her eyes, God help him, were unchanged, that same light of defiance and mercy. She did not look away when she saw him. She merely inclined her head, the way one greets a ghost who deserves acknowledgement but not resurrection. The crowd blurred. Conversation dissolved into a low hum beneath the thundering quiet inside him. He began to move toward her, one step, then another, until a small figure intercepted him. A boy, perhaps 7, perhaps 8, darted through the guests, clutching a wooden toy soldier. He stumbled, fell, and before the Duke could think, instinct carried him forward. He knelt to help the child to his feet. The boy looked up, grey eyes, steady and clear as a winter river. The Duke froze. It was as though the earth had remembered something it was never meant to repeat. The child's features were hers, unmistakably, but the eyes were his. "Thank you, sir," the boy said with polite precision. brushing off his coat. His accent was soft country, his manners well-schooled. "You should take more care," the Duke managed, his voice unsteady. "The garden paths can be deceptive." "Yes, Your Grace." The boy's bow was clumsy, untrained, utterly sincere. Then he turned toward the woman waiting at the edge of the terrace. "Mrs. Hale," he called, "Mrs. Hale." The name struck like a stone in still water. Clara met the Duke's gaze as the boy ran to her, her expression unreadable. When the child clung to her hand, she rested her palm atop his hair, a small, protective gesture that said everything he hadn't dared to ask. Their eyes met again across the distance. He did not smile, neither did she. The air between them was filled with all the words they had never spoken. And then, before anyone could see what memory had just risen from the grave, she turned and guided the boy toward the other guests. He followed her through the day, without admitting he was doing so. Every time she moved, from the tea tent to the rose arbor, his gaze found her as if the years between them had been nothing more than breath held too long. She laughed once, softly, without extravagance, at something the boy said, and the sound undid him completely. By afternoon, when the crowd thinned, he crossed the lawn to where she stood by the fountain, pretending to admire the lilies floating on the water. "Mrs. Hale," he said, the name tasting like betrayal. She turned, composed as a duchess, though the pulse at her throat betrayed a tremor. "Your Grace," she replied, curtsying with flawless control. "So you do recognize me?" Her lips curved faintly, a smile without joy. The Duke of Ravenshire is difficult to forget, even for those who try. He studied her face, the delicate armor of poise she wore. "I thought you were dead." "Many women are," she said quietly. "Some continue walking." Her calm was a cruelty he both admired and despised. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "The boy is my son," she said, before he could wound himself further. "His father?" Her eyes met his, steady and merciful. "He has none?" He flinched, not at the lie, but at the grace with which she told it. The orchestra began another waltz, its rhythm cruelly perfect. She inclined her head once more. "Excuse me, Your Grace, my pupil is waiting." And she left him standing there, surrounded by music, drowning in the memory of a single night that had somehow survived the years. When the guests finally departed and the estate fell quiet, the Duke walked through the garden alone. The roses were past bloom. Petals floated in the fountain like fallen confessions. He picked one up without knowing why. It smelled faintly of rain and memory. He closed his fist around it until the thorns bit skin. London soon forgot the fete, as it forgets everything that does not rhyme with scandal. The guests spoke of roses and the cleverness of the musicians. No one spoke of the moment when the Duke of Ravenshire had turned to stone at the sight of a governess in blue. Only the servants remembered the silence that followed the music, a silence that behaved like a ghost that had finally found its room. He told himself that recognition could be mistaken, people resembled each other, memory could be a trick of light. But the lie lasted a night and not an hour more. At dawn, he sent a messenger to the neighbouring estate, requesting the list of tutors and attendants employed there. The reply arrived before breakfast. Mrs. Hale, widowed, references from Dorset, in service since the previous spring. The paper trembled slightly in his hand, as though it knew it had been caught lying. He began to see her everywhere. The colour of her dress appeared in every shadowed hallway. Her voice, steady, clear, precise, hid in the pages of books he could no longer finish. He rode for hours through the park and found that every turn of the path led him back to the memory of her standing by the fountain, her son at her side. He dined with ministers, with dowagers, with young ladies whose parents dreamed of titles, and in the middle of a toast or a laugh he would hear her say, "He has none." When obsession is born of remorse, it pretends at first to be duty. He told himself he must ensure she was safe, that the child lacked nothing, that the past could be managed like an estate if one kept proper ledgers. He sent anonymous funds to the school where she taught. He arranged repairs to the cottages near her village, claiming weather damage. Each good deed made the guilt worse, because kindness given in secret only feeds the hunger it tries to cure. One afternoon he rode out to the border of his lands, where the village road turned toward the hills. He had no business there except hope. The air smelled of hay, and the kind of peace that offends the restless. In the distance, near a hedge of late-blooming roses, he saw her walking with the boy. She carried a basket. The child carried a book. Their conversation drifted toward him, fragments of a lesson, the small, bright laughter that children give as a gift to people they trust. He dismounted, meaning to turn back before she saw him, and then she looked up. They faced each other across the narrow path. No servants, no title, no reason to pretend. "Your Grace," she said, inclining her head with the same composure she had used to protect herself at the fete. "Mrs. Hale." He removed his hat, though the gesture did nothing to shorten the distance between them. "I did not expect Ravenshire to ride this far from London." "Nor I to find the reason for it," he said, and regretted the honesty as soon as it was spoken. She glanced at the boy who had stepped forward to examine the Duke's horse with the solemn curiosity of youth. "Julian," she said gently, "we mustn't delay the gentleman." "Your pupil?" he asked. "My son," she corrected, her tone polite, final. Julian looked up. "You're the Duke," he said, as if it were the answer to a riddle he had been solving. "I am," the Duke said. "Do you ride?" The boy nodded gravely. "When mother allows." "Then she is wise." He smiled, a small, involuntary betrayal of feeling, and saw Clara's expression soften before it vanished again behind caution. When they parted, she offered the smallest of curtsies. "Please do not trouble yourself to visit your Grace. We are well provided for." "I would sleep better knowing you are," he said. "Then learn to sleep without comfort." She walked away before he could reply, the boy skipping beside her, sunlight caught in his hair. That night he returned to London and burned 3 letters he had written to her over the years and never sent. He watched the flames consume the words, "Forgive me, I did not know. He has your eyes." The ashes left no comfort. He imagined her sitting by a lamp, reading aloud to the boy from a book he had never heard, her voice steady and patient. He wondered whether she ever thought of him with anything softer than pity. Weeks passed. He attended Parliament and found speeches turning to ghosts in his mouth. He avoided mirrors because they were too honest. He began to write again, not to her, but to himself, in notebooks that filled and emptied with thoughts that could not be spoken aloud. "She has survived me," he wrote once, "and that is what goodness looks like when heaven declines to interfere." In the countryside, rumours began to spread. The Duke of Ravenshire was changed. He refused invitations. He dismissed flatterers. He spent his evenings walking through his own gardens as if waiting for someone he had once buried there. The servants whispered that he spoke to the roses, and perhaps he did. Late one evening, when the city was a map of gaslight and regret, a footman delivered a note misdirected from the neighbouring estate. It was addressed to Mrs. Hale and sealed in haste, The messenger had mistaken his route. The Duke broke the wax before he remembered not to. The letter was short, a request for her presence at the school signed by a magistrate. But beneath the neat lines was a signature that turned the air in his lungs to fire: Clara Whitmore. He read it twice, each time slower. The alias had been protection, not denial. She had never truly ceased to be herself. He folded the paper carefully, as though it might bruise, and sat for a long time in the silence of the library. Outside, rain began, soft and unthreatening, like an old promise returning to test his resolve. By dawn he had made his decision. He would see her again, not as a duke with apologies, not as a man with claims, but as someone who had learned that love, when starved of words, becomes hunger. He would not beg, he would not command. He would simply arrive, as weather does, hoping she might open the window rather than the door. The storm came with the punctuality of old vows, arriving not as spectacle, but as sentence. By evening the sky had lowered itself until the chimneys wore it like a weight. By night the rain began, first as counsel, then as command. Clara stood at the cottage window with a hand on Julian's brow and felt heat arguing against reason. He had been flushed since afternoon, restless since supper, and now his breath had taken to counting distances she could not shorten. The apothecary's powders waited in their envelopes with the confidence of men who had never met this particular fever. She lit another candle. The flame bent beneath the draught and recovered, which is the most courage a flame can be expected to show. "Mother," Julian whispered, voice thin but stubborn, "read the page about ships." He reached for the book and failed by an inch. She put it in his hand and listened as he pretended to read, lips moving through a story he already knew by heart. When the sentence faltered, she finished it for him and smiled as if triumph had been intended all along. His lashes lowered. The candle threw his shadow up across the plaster. Her child, her decision, her one night finding its arithmetic at last. The knock, when it came, chose mercy over drama. One tap, then two. Clara's spine knew before her mind did. She opened the door into weather and found not a servant with instructions, but the Duke himself. Hat dark with rain, coat disciplined into obedience, eyes that had seen the garden 7 years ago and had not forgiven the sun since. "Mrs. Hale," he said, and the alias was a courtesy he handled like porcelain. "Forgive me. The magistrate's note was misdelivered to my house. I brought it myself." He extended the folded paper with the solemnity of a treaty. Then, seeing her expression shift beyond the paper toward need, he added, softly, as if learning how to pronounce prayer, "What do you require?" "Nothing," she said, and the lie broke in her mouth like a glass. "Everything." He did not enter. He waited at the threshold until she stepped aside and made the space a permission. He crossed it, left the rain outside, and arrived as a man. The room took him in, the small hearth, the table with its patient books, the bed where a child attempted to appear brave. He moved to the bedside with the deference of someone approaching a grave, and knelt. "Julian," he said, tasting the name the way some men taste brandy after years of abstaining. "You will forgive an intruder?" Julian's glance wavered from fever to curiosity. "Your Grace," he murmured, "because children will always choose ceremony when strength fails." "We have the chapter on the Endeavour. Mother says the wind can change." "It can," the Duke said, laying 2 fingers at the boy's wrist, counting like a penitent. "And we can, too." Clara brought cool water and a cloth. He took them without looking at her hand, as if not trusting himself to remember its history. Together, without instruction, without argument, they tended the child. Cool at the brow, a measured sip, a story resumed. When the fever climbed, the Duke rose and stoked the fire with the unshowy competence of men who have burned their own letters. When the wind found the gap in the window sash, he sealed it with his handkerchief and a vow he did not speak aloud. When the boy shivered, the Duke removed his coat and arranged its weight over the blanket, like authority repurposed as kindness. "Mother," Julian said in his small, dreamer's voice, "tell the part about the stars the sailors followed." Clara opened the book, but her sight blurred. The Duke took it, not from presumption, but from rescue. He read in a voice that remembered church and forgot guilt, steady as latitude. Of constellations that refused to lose their names, of sailors who believed a map could keep a man from drowning if his courage learned to read. The room settled around the sound. Even the rain, being English, reduced its enthusiasm to a thoughtful patter. When the fever broke its first inch downward, relief entered like a veteran, suspicious and grateful. Clara sat, her hands folded as if they had just been taught gentleness. The Duke closed the book and looked, truly looked, at the small, sleeping body between them. He did not weep. He did something rarer. He allowed his face to forget that it had ever been required to perform. "At the chapel," he said, voice quiet enough to be disbelieved, "I was a man who mistook penance for virtue. I let the city name us, and then pretended I had done a noble thing by refusing to argue." He lifted his gaze to hers. "For years, I told myself you had chosen absence as a weapon. You chose it as a shelter. I see it now." "Shelters are only as strong as the weather," she answered, unable to manage cruelty and unwilling to manage forgiveness. "And the weather never asked my permission." He nodded once, the way one does when told a truth too late to prevent harm. "If there is blame," he began, and she stopped him with the smallest shake of her head. "Blame is a luxury," she said. "We used ours up long ago." They sat in the honest quiet of people who have run out of falsehoods. The candle had burned itself into a chalice of wax. The hearth had found its correct tempo. The boy dreamed a sailor's dream of harbours that are not merely ends, but beginnings that have learned prudence. When Clara reached to adjust the blanket, her hand brushed the Duke's. Both withdrew as if from flame, then returned, deliberate, as if courage had decided to pay its debt in full. "You were my husband for one night," she said, and the sentence did not tremble. "You gave me a name, and then you took it from yourself. I kept what I could." She glanced at Julian. "When you appeared in the garden, I called it punishment. Tonight, I am willing to call it weather." He exhaled, involuntary, unregal. "Then let me be useful in it." He looked around the modest room and saw a cathedral. "I can provide a physician, a carriage at your door, a house where winter cannot instruct the bones. I can do this without asking anything you do not wish to give." "And what do you wish?" she asked, because dignity prefers invoices to hints. He did not play the Duke. "To be permitted to wish," he said simply, "to stand where you are and not be refused for my history." Silence again, this time of a different species, trembling not with fear, but with inventory. She studied his face and found there both the sentence and the petition. The old anger rose, glanced off the evidence of the last hour, and set itself down with a sigh like a chair accepting a difficult guest. "He is yours," she said, and the storm chose that moment to take a breath. "And mine! If you are to be in his life, it will be for his sake first. If you are to be in mine, it will be—" She searched for a word that was not a pledge and not a wound. Because you have learned how to stay without hiding? He bowed his head, not as nobles bow, but as men who have stumbled upon altars they did not build. When he lifted his hand to her cheek, it was with reverence rather than right. "I can learn," he said. "I have been practicing absence. I would prefer to practice presence." She did not lean away. The touch was brief and clean, like a signature written in honest ink. Outside, the wind reconsidered its case and withdrew to the eaves. The candle's flame, scandalized into steadiness, resumed its small sermon on endurance. "Rest," he said, arranging the coat more securely over Julian. "I will keep the watch." "You do not have to." "I prefer to," he answered, and took the chair by the bed with the patient posture of penance, repurposed as care. The night did not end in declarations. It ended the way most salvations begin, with a mother sleeping in a chair, a father counting breaths that were not his own, and a house remembering how to hold 3 people without telling London about it. Toward dawn, the fever's arithmetic improved. The Duke's head bowed, not in defeat, but in permission to the body he had denied rest. Clara woke and found them, as she had always suspected they could be, 3 fragments of a broken story, learning the grammar of a better one. Outside, the storm gave the morning back. Spring returned with the humility of one who has broken something and come back to mend it. Ravenshire's gardens bloomed again, cautious at first, then reckless with colour. The estate, once a monument to silence, had learned to practice gentleness. Curtains no longer shivered at every footstep. The rooms accepted laughter as if remembering its grammar. The Duke walked those gardens in the early hours, hands clasped behind him, the weight of former years finally behaving like memory instead of punishment. The world had forgiven him without asking his consent, which is how forgiveness usually works. London no longer whispered about his vanished bride or the child that might have been. Society, being bored, had found newer sins to praise. He paused beside the rose arbour, her rose arbour now. Clara had planted the new stems herself, practical in her straw gloves, quiet and certain as the weather she had survived. The roses were pale, nearly white, with faint pink edges like blush, returning to a long, cold face. He touched one, careful not to harm it, and wondered whether Grace was always this silent. Inside the house, a child's laughter rang down the hall. "Julian?" The sound startled the servants still, though they pretended otherwise. He was everything his parents were not, sunlight given form. He had his mother's steadiness and his father's curious restraint, as if he had inherited both halves of their discipline and found a kinder way to live them. The Duke found them together in the schoolroom, bent over a map. Clara looked up first. Her eyes met his, not with the defiance of years ago, but with that rare, hard-won calm that grows only from having nothing left to prove. "He's tracing voyages," she said, smiling faintly. "He's decided the sea is fairer than Parliament." "Then he will be wise early," the Duke replied, leaning over the map. "But he must still learn where the storms are." Clara watched him as he spoke to Julian, the low warmth in his tone, the ease with which command had learned compassion. He had changed, not into another man, but into himself. That, she thought, was rarer than miracles. Later, when Julian had run outside to chase his own geography, they stood by the window. Beyond the glass, sunlight trembled through leaves, making even the old stones seem momentarily merciful. "London writes us differently now," he said quietly. "Their stories are kind." "Then they must be fiction," she answered. He smiled, the small, real one she had learned to trust. "If they knew the truth, that I still wake in the night to make sure you have not vanished, they would call it obsession again. "Let them," she said. "It will only make the truth quieter." The years had taught them both the art of choosing stillness over spectacle. They did not parade reconciliation. They lived it. Small habits of care, unannounced mercies, the dignity of staying. Some evenings she read aloud while he repaired the clasp of her locket. Sometimes they spoke of the past, more often they did not. Love, when rebuilt from ruin, prefers understatement. On the anniversary of their first night, they rode together into the hills where the air forgot to remember grief. The countryside was thick with new bloom. The horses moved easily, unhurried. When they reached the ridge overlooking the river, he dismounted and stood beside her, the wind arranging their silences. "I once thought that night destroyed us," he said. "It did," she answered gently, "but it also began the rest." He looked at her then, as he had looked in the chapel, as he had looked across years of absence, except now the gaze was unguarded. "If there is heaven," he murmured, "it will not be angels. It will be this, weather, and you, and a child asleep in a house that forgives." She laid her hand over his, the gesture neither promise nor apology, only truth acknowledging itself. "You always were too eloquent for redemption," she said, smiling through the ache. "Then you will have to interpret me," he replied. Evening gathered slowly. They turned back before dark, the road leading them home through meadows shimmering with twilight. From afar, Ravenshaw Hall looked less like a fortress and more like what it had become, a house with its heart unbarred. At the gate, Julian waited, holding something behind his back. When they reached him, he presented it solemnly, a single rosebud, pale and new. "For the room where the rain stopped," he said, shyly repeating his mother's words. The Duke took the flower, unable to speak, and Clara bent to kiss her son's hair. Together they walked into the house, the door closing softly behind them, not as ending, but as promise. That night, when the lamps were dim and the house breathed evenly around them, Clara stood at the window once more. The garden glimmered below, heavy with scent and memory. She touched the locket at her throat, the two pressed petals within, jasmine and rose, and whispered, almost to herself, "One night, and all a lifetime to live it." Behind her the Duke stirred, half-waking, murmuring her name as one does a prayer rather than a person. She turned, smiled, and let the candle burn lower, until dawn rehearsed its entrance. Outside, the river kept its slow vow, and the house, no longer haunted, held its peace.